Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Elaine, and thanks to everybody for coming. What I want to do today is really talk about where the roots of women's oppression lie, not by talking too much about the history, although I'll do a sort of very brief outline of that, but really about the roots of women's oppression under capitalism, because there are obviously many theories as to why women that still play, if you like, an inferior role in society. They get paid less, they have to do the bulk of childcare, all of those different questions. There's also lots of questions about the family, because the family is in many ways quite different from perhaps our traditional view of the family. So I want to try and deal with both of those today, and then hopefully we can have a discussion about what they will mean. So what I want to start with is this quote from Friedrich Engels, which is a very famous quote. It's from his preface to the first edition of a book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. And I always think it's important to have the whole title of that book, because actually he links the development of a family which oppresses women with also the development of society in such a way that a minority begin to accumulate private property. They manage to hold on to private property. They develop a state machine in order to protect their private property, and they develop a family form which is about ensuring that their property is passed down through different generations, and that they know who their children are, they know all these different kind of questions. And he ties this very much up with class society, and he says in this famous quote, he says, according to the materialist conception, the determining factor in history is in the final instance, and all of these are quite important little clauses in it, is in the final instance the production and reproduction of the immediate essentials of life. On the one side, the production of the means of existence, and on the other side, the propagation of the species. Now, what does he mean by this? What he means is that on the one hand, people have to work in order to produce their material, the things that keep them going, their housing, their food, their clothing, all of these things. People have to work, and in different societies, they obviously work in very different ways in order to produce those things. But he also says that there's also, on the other hand, the reproduction of the species. And that is, again, something that we all have to say is something that continues to be, whatever condition under which children are born and brought up and socialized and all these kind of things, is obviously an essential part of the development and continuation of human beings and of human society. So he talks about these. He does actually say, if you look further on in his preface, he says that as society develops, it tends to be that the first tends to dominate the second, you know, that the question of how you work and what kind of work you do and how you produce goods tends to become more important and dominates the way in which you operate within the family and how the species is reproduced. But nonetheless, he sees them as two very important fundamentals of any human society. So this quote has always led to a whole range, as lots of Marx and Engels do, a whole range of different interpretations as to what it means. And, you know, are these things absolutely equal? Is the production of goods and materials of an equal value as the production of human beings? There are some theories, including some social reproduction theories, which say that social reproduction is as absolutely central to capitalism as the exploitation of wage labor, which of course is the source of the first means of production that he talks about. So there's a lot of different debates as to what these mean, but you have to, I think, look at them as being very closely connected, however much, you know, they may differ from different societies. And that for Engels, he described the development of the family, class society, the state, and so on, as the world historic defeat of the female sex, by which he meant that once you began to have a class society, once you had a family which was based at least partly on property, once you had all these institutions growing up, it was the women who would be in an inferior position and who would, because of their reproductive role, would be at a disadvantage. Now, there's no automatic reason, as we should all be aware, that because you have a reproductive role, it means that you should earn less money or you should be treated as a sex object, or that there's anything natural about these things. There isn't, but particularly when you talk about earlier societies, you're talking about societies where the reproductive role was very, very central in terms of what was was very, very central to society itself, and therefore the whole period of giving birth, of breastfeeding, of maybe several years of doing these kind of things was something which meant that women obviously were less able to work outside of the home, were less able to travel, were less able to be hunters, and all these kind of things, you know, when he talks about early societies and how you begin to see that break down. Now, I don't want to talk about all the development of all the different families and the different societies since then. I want to talk about the capitalist society and the capitalist family. And the crucial thing, I think, about the capitalist family compared to every other family, to the best of my knowledge, or pretty much every other family, if you look through human history, is that most family structures, institutions are in most of history, work and, in other words, reproduction of subsistence and of goods is very closely connected to the reproduction of human beings. In other words, people work around the family. You know, for very large parts of human history, this has been mainly in agriculture, where again you'll have people working very, very close to home, if you want to call it. Sometimes people have worked in much bigger units of what we call the family, where whole series of people who were related would work together. But it was essentially the home and the family and the upbringing of the next generation were very closely connected physically as well as ideologically, I suppose. And that was true not just of agriculture, but if you think of apprenticeships, for example, in this country, certainly in the early modern period, you had apprentices would go and live in the master's house and would be part of the household and would do their work around the household. So all of those things were very much part of it. But of course, the capitalist family is the first family where work and home are separated, and separated in a very fundamental way, that you go out to work in order to produce whatever goods you need for your subsistence. And that was something that was very obvious in the early years of not the development of early British capitalism, but when you talk about the Industrial Revolution and that period of the sort of, you know, the rocket booster of the Industrial Revolution and what that meant for British capitalism and manufacturing, what you found was that people who previously might have had their living at home, for example, people who worked in textiles or people who worked in food production, you would find this was transferred more and more to places outside of the home. In other words, people in those days had to walk very long distances to go and work in a textile mill, and would work in those mills for very long hours a day. I mean, their whole working day, if you included getting to and from, was probably about 16 hours a day. And when you look at those, the mills would employ people, very large numbers of women. They became a very substantial part of the working class in the late 18th, early 19th century. Very substantial numbers of children who worked from tiny, you know, ages 4 or 5, working in the cotton mills and working sometimes in coal mines, as did women in those days. All of those, you saw the capitalist family, the separation of work and home. Now, Engels saw that as he believed that the working class family would disappear as a result of industrialization. He thought that that what would happen would be that everyone would have to go out to work. There would be nobody caring for the children. There were huge levels of infant mortality. That somehow there would be people who just cared for the children as a separate thing, but that the working class family would not continue to exist in the way that he believed the ruling class or the middle class families would continue to exist, because they were much more based on property. He said the working class has no property, everybody goes out to work. they won't need the family and they'll break from the family. And he saw that as something which would be an advance for women and for women's oppression. Now, actually, that didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. All the tendencies were towards it breaking down in the early part of the 19th century, but there were all sorts of legal and other means by which the family was re-established. So by the middle, or certainly by the kind of 1860s, the whole model of the Victorian family was one which also spread down into the working class, if you like, and therefore the family was sort of re-established, and it was re-established with an ideal model of what is sometimes called the male breadwinner family, that the man would go out to work, would earn enough in order to keep his family, his wife and his children, and that the wife would spend her time caring for the home, caring for the children, doing housework, all the other kind of things. Now, that was never a totally accurate picture of the working class family. First, there were many people who didn't get the male breadwinner wage, which was sufficient to cover the costs of reproduction of the whole family. But also, it didn't always work because women still continued to do paid work, for example, taking in laundry, having lodgers, all those sorts of things were, and sometimes working outside the home. I mean, in the textile industry, women continued to work right through until the 20th century, married women very often full-time, and actually had far fewer children than most other working class women at the time, precisely because they did have jobs outside the home and they didn't have them. So the family changed in that way. And of course, it's changed again. I mean, since the end of the First World War, and particularly from the Second World War, you've had much more the idea of a male-headed nuclear family, which was based on the man working full-time, the woman working part-time, and the children, and caring for the children in the intervening period. Of course, you also, over this period, you've got children spending much, much longer time in education. If you talk about the 19th century, this didn't exist for many children. Now you're talking about people in education from the age of 4 or 5 to the age of 18. So, all these are different factors that go on. So all of these have changed. But in the last 20 or 30 years, you've seen even more dramatic changes over these kind of things, because you've had the development of neoliberal capitalism has also made huge changes to the working class family, and to families of all classes actually, but to the working class family for the purposes of our discussion. And what you see with neoliberal family is that capitalism works to break down the family, and you see this all the time. I mean, there's a woman called Hester Eisenstein who wrote a good book called Feminism Seduced, which people might be interested in reading. And she talks about feminism as being the solvent that dissolves the family in, particularly she talks about in the developing world, in the global south, and so on. And the consequence of this is the dissolution of much of the functions of the family is to release millions and millions of women from the home, from childcare, to go and work in the factories, both in their own countries, but also, of course, many millions of them migrate to the global north and work largely, not exclusively, but largely in roles which very often carry out the domestic work of middle and upper class families, doing childcare, doing cleaning, doing all those kind of jobs. So that's one thing that that happens with the working class family in the modern period, and we see it ourselves. Another thing that happens in countries like Britain, the United States, Ireland, most of the wealthier countries, the wealthier capitalist countries, is you see a breakdown of the kind of traditional views of the family. So, for example, you have families which are maybe single parent families. You have families where you have same-sex marriage or civil partnership. So you have families where you have gay men or lesbians as both the parents in a particular relationship. You have much, much higher prevalence of divorce. So you have many families where there are children from previous relationships and so on. So in other words, the whole picture of the 1950s, I suppose, of the traditional family begins to break down. But one of the things I want to argue is that this is only up to a certain extent, and that actually one of the things that neoliberal capitalism has done very, very successfully is to kind of incorporate, if you like, the non-standard family, the people who don't count themselves as part of the standard family, into the family system. And I would say they've done that pretty well. So just to look at these figures, there's 19.5 million families. There's families and there's households, which I hope won't be too confusing to people. It's not that difficult to understand, but there's far more households than there are families. I'll try and explain that. But in 2023, there were 19.5 million families in the UK. So all these people who say, oh, the family doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, this simply is fantasy. I mean, that's a huge number of families. And that's an increase of just over 1 million families since 2013. Married or civil partnered couple families make up 66%. So in other words, 2/3 of people are either in the heterosexual marriage or the homosexual marriage bracket, if you like, or civil partnership. But overwhelmingly, if you look, for example, since same-sex marriage became legalized, the number of civil partnerships between people of the same sex has gone down quite dramatically, while the number of marriages among same-sex couples has gone up. You know, they'd rather be married, if you like, than be in civil partnerships. But anyway, that's something we can perhaps talk about. But I think it's at least partly that the whole institution of marriage, and it's a very odd thing, because again, if you look at the number of marriages in British society, it goes down all the time. The people who are actually getting married goes down all the time. But the whole way in which marriage is, you know, is kind of reified, if you like, the whole way in which it is seen as something to aspire to, is a very important part of bourgeois culture. I mean, lots of marriages now, and usually they're either better off working class people or people from the middle and upper classes, are very elaborate things. You know, if you read about the history of marriage in the working class, like 100 years ago even, a great many people got married on bank holidays, because they didn't have a lot of time off work. They went in their working clothes. They didn't have white dresses. You know, this is true even right up into the 1920s, 1930s. Whitsun was always a very popular time for weddings, because it was a time when, you know, people had a holiday. So, you know, those were fairly sort of mundane occasions, and people might just go and have a sort of, you know, a bit of a buffet somewhere, and that was the end of it. You weren't going off to a Greek island for a week, or, you know, or having 12 bridesmaids, or all the other kind of things that people talk about. So that whole idea of marriage, it's a very weird contradiction, but it's still the case that 2/3 of these are people who are essentially in the two-parent with children role, and that is important. Cohabiting couple families are another 18%. So again, although they're not legally married, and there's been a massive change in my lifetime over the attitudes towards marriage and having children outside of marriage, which was very much frowned on until really, well, at least the 1970s was when it began to change, really, partly as a result of the women's movement and changing attitudes towards things. But there was this very strong sense that you had to be actually legally married. That clearly isn't the case in the same way now. So another 18% are cohabiting, and then you've got another 16% are lone parent. So these aren't insubstantial figures, but actually, if you look at the numbers that make up, well, that's 84% make up the two-parent and children, or maybe not children, but make up the what would be regarded as a normal family in inverted commas. And lone parents is quite interesting. Lone fathers, not surprisingly, far less than there are lone mothers, but they make up 15% of the lone parent families. And they're more likely to include adult children. I don't know if anyone's got any theories about that, but it's quite interesting about, you know, that adult children may well live with maybe a widowed or divorced father, whereas the the lone mother families are much more likely to have dependent children still on them. So, you know, those figures are, I think, are quite interesting, because I think they do, so that they show the way in which, despite the changes and the very liberal ways in which people now talk about, you know, it's fine about we have much more diverse families, it's fine for people not to get married, it's fine for same-sex marriage, all the things that are widely accepted in society and are regarded by most people as perfectly okay. Actually, the reality is still that they're very much forced into this kind of box, which is the family. And sorry, what have I done? Yeah, so we've got those. I mean, that's just the figures, really, and they've more or less. I mean, if you look at it, it's more or less the same, tiny bit different. Lone parents exactly the same, slightly fewer cohabiting couples and slightly more married couples. So, you know, it's definitely, this is something which is a part of the way things are going. Now, with households, which includes people who aren't just regarded as in family units, so people on their own, for example, living on their own, 28.4 million households. 2 in 3 households include one family. So again, the vast majority of households include a family, either a couple, family with or without children, or a lone parent family. 8.4 million people living alone in the UK last year, which is 30% of all households, which is quite a lot. But then when you begin to break it down, and it's 13% of all people living in households. But then when you look at it, who is the, you know, what's the time? You might think this is young people, but actually the vast majority of them are people who are aged over 65. So you have to assume divorced. You have to assume that probably at some point, not all of them obviously, but the majority of them will have lived in some kind of family, and probably the reason they live on their own is either divorce or the death of their partner, I guess is the main reason. So you see far fewer people, and when you get down, I mean, far fewer younger people are living alone, which is quite interesting. But again, I suppose points to the fact of the resilience of the 2-person family, and that particularly when you're bringing up children, that this is something that people tend to do. Although there is a slight increase in the younger cohorts, which again may be to do with housing crisis, maybe to do with all sorts of other things. I don't know what the answer to that is. Now, when we're talking about this, I think what you're seeing is the endurance of the working class family. Despite all the changes, the essence of it really remains the same. And of course, the changes are very, very much connected with women working outside the home. And again, the picture, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, then the majority of women who worked part-time. There was a marriage bar, as it was called, in all sorts of industries, in the civil service until the 1950s. In education, you couldn't be a school teacher if you were married until quite late. Peak Freen's biscuit factory, which had an extremely good sociological study done of it in the 1950s, barred any of their employees from working there after marriage, and there were other factories that did the same. You know, so there was the whole idea was work was for single women or women before they got married and had children. That was the idea of it. But of course, there's a huge change in that now. Women's employment in Britain is very high, 72% against 78% for men. So not much difference, really. I mean, it's, you know, 6% difference. And that is bigger than the United States, for example, quite a lot bigger than the United States. It's not the highest in the world, but it's very high. It's gone up. One reason it's gone up is they've raised the age that women can retire and get a state pension. So there's a lot of women in their late 50s and 60s who are working longer in order to make sure that they can live. Sorry, how long have I got to? Oh my God. Okay, sorry. So anyway, so there were, but obviously a lot of them are part-time, 10 million full-time, 6 million part-time. There's been strong growth, though, in full-time employment. And I think you have to put that down, not to people's choice, but to necessity of wages being very low, maybe single parents, but even if there's couples, we all know the pressure of the reduction in wages that people have seen. And one of the ways people take up the slack is that women have been working more. And of course they get, I won't go through all these figures, but basically this tells you that the women are paid, women are so undervalued in terms of the amount that they're paid. And this is very closely connected to their role as wives and mothers. Not that every woman is a wife or a mother and has children. That isn't true. And even those who don't have it for most of their lives. But it has an absolutely fundamental effect on what jobs they do, which tend to be different jobs from men. If they do the same jobs as men, they're nearly always in lower grades. They're nearly always with less chance of promotion. They're nearly always people who have to take more time off, both in terms of having children with maternity leave, but also if children are sick, if there are any issues that come up, then it's the women who do so and therefore are regarded as less reliable and therefore less likely to be promoted and all those different kind of things. So just to kind of conclude, and I'll have to do it very quickly, as I said, I think the essence of the family is still very, very much with us. And that's because the centrality of the family is the reproduction of labour power. If you imagine how much it would cost, well, we know how much it costs when you have to pay for nurseries. It costs an absolute fortune. Imagine if the women and men, because some men obviously do work in the home, imagine if the costs that if all the things they do were paid with a wage, there would be it would be billions and billions, trillions of pounds. And therefore it's so much in the interests of the capitalist class, of the state, and of the individual capitalists to have the family where people do this work for nothing. And the costs of reproduction are pushed onto the family. And this has been a big increase in this over the last 40 years. The costs of care, and people know this again from their own experiences, caring for the sick, caring for the elderly, caring for children, more and more is pushed onto the family. At the same time, each member of the family has to throw themselves onto the labour market in order to get in order to have enough income to cover the costs of reproduction. So it's not just the man and the woman, but adult children who work, younger children work, pensioners work now in a way that was very, very unusual when I was young. All of these things have really changed. And of course, it's a massive site of consumption. It's not just a site of bringing up children, but it's a site of consumption that every single household has a washing machine, has a cooker, has whatever, and pay huge amounts for them. Just finally, I just want to highlight really the class divisions in the family. I've talked about the working class family. It's an interesting fact that if you look today, there's been a big increase in paid domestic labour, people working in or around the home for other people, right? Essentially, what you find is the only people now who are doing housework and domestic labour are the working class. That every other class manages to pay for the nannies, the childminders, all the things that people pay for. And of course, working class people do some of that themselves and have to do some of that themselves, but they're not in a position, obviously, to do so. So there are very, very strong class differences in terms of the family. And I think you have to look at that in terms of the root of that oppression, both at work and in the home. So I'll leave it there, and sorry for sort of rushing that through at the last part.